Hey guys, so in this tutorial, we're going to be covering the tools that I use the most often when unwrapping. Now, this tutorial assumes that you already understand unwrapping theory and the basics of how to unwrap things. I'm just going to be covering the tools that I use the most. That way, when you're viewing the other tutorials, you'll understand what I'm doing, what buttons I'm pressing, and how to access them. So let's get started. So to start off, let's just bring in a sphere here. I made this earlier and just popped it in a layer. And so let's start with the basics here. Obviously, popping open the UV editor. I'll move the toolkit to the side. And so, okay, so what do I use the most? Well, first of all, I want to point out something that might not be very obvious, especially if you're coming from another program, is that when you're selecting UVs, you're going to see them at the same time in your 3D viewport as you do in the UV window. Now, the important thing here is that if you delete the UVs, if you select them and hit delete, they're gone here, but the model still remains. Now, if I undo that, and let's go over here and just hover the mouse over the 3D window. If you have the actual polygon selected, I had the verts, that's the issue there. If you have the polygon selected and delete, it will do both. So again, if you're in the UV window, press delete, your model is still going to be there. But if you're hovering over the 3D, it's actually going to get rid of your geometry. So this is actually really useful. Sometimes I will select things in the UV window just to have them selected in the modeling window and then make changes. So selecting things via the UV window, very good. I like it a lot. That's the first thing. Okay, so now what else do I usually do? So let's make a copy of this guy. So usually when I'm working, the first thing I'll do is simply select all the objects and I'll do a planar map, just a regular planar map. And I'll do this by shift right clicking in here, going up to mapping and then planar mapping. And that's what that looks like. It can be found up here as well. You got planar, best plane, automatic. One thing to be aware of within the planar options, there's bounding box, best plane, and you could choose where to project from. I like to have it on best plane because that way you can kind of guesstimate which way it's going to be projecting the UVs out. So that's what I'll usually do first. However, before this, I'll typically have my seams placed, right? So to go through that real quick, it's just a matter of selecting my edges in the viewport here, right? So again, with selections, you could click to select, double click to get your loop, or if you want to select a ring, clicking one, holding shift and double clicking one near it, or I guess adjacent to it, we'll select the ring. And then of course, if you just want a portion, you can select one, go further away, hold shift and double click, and you're just going to get the ones in between. This works for loops and rings. So I will go through and, for example, just set a bunch of seams. So I'll shift right click and I will, well, maybe I do in this view. Let's see here. Oh yeah, it was in here. And then cut. So now we could see the white line there. That means those UVs are cut. So I'm usually just going around when you see these lines appearing everywhere. I'm just going through and I'm just cutting everything. Selecting what I want, shift, right click, over to cut. And you could find cut in here as well, I believe under cut and sew. Boop. And so I have hotkeys for those. Super useful. Anything you're going to use often, you definitely want to do that. So we have this here, and now if I select again these and planar map them, it's going to get rid of those. So we have to be aware that when you planar map everything you have selected, it's going to clear out your seams. And so I'll usually planar map before I do anything else because I just want there to be UVs on my object. So this, by planar mapping, I'm essentially saying, hey, I want every face on the 3D model to have a UV representation. And then I'll go through like we just saw, right? Grab a couple of these, wherever I want the seams to be, hit cut. And now if I grab the shell and move it, it's gonna only pull that shell. So that's super handy. And then to get to the shell there like I did, and this is something I do very often as well, and it might be too quick to see a lot of times, but I'm essentially either double clicking, because that will select just the shell. In the 3D viewport, it's going to select the entire object because it's all one piece. But in your UVs here, they're separate. So that's a good way to kind of break them apart. But otherwise, to get to shell, you could just regular right click, or sorry, control right click, and then you have your selection options, and then you could do the UV shell. So I'll grab it and go over, but double clicking works as well. So the next thing I want to point out, I don't use this one as much, but I want people to be aware it exists because it's kind of confusing, is when you're in your 3D view and you right click to select different options here, if you go vertex face, you guys might have seen this and it tripped me out the first time I saw it. I thought I broke something. I was very confused, but you're actually able to select the individual UVs. So normally you're looking at regular vertex mode, right? You have this one vert, but this is actually a vert of each of these 4 different faces. And so if you only wanted to select the one here, and where this came in handy for me the most, I believe, when I was using it is when I was like vertex coloring, which doesn't happen too often these days, but you might have other reasons that you want to do this. So right click vertex face, and now you could just select the vertex of that polygon and then do what you will to it. So I wanted to point that out because if you see that, you didn't break anything. It's weird. You might never use it, but now you know what it's for and what you can do with it. Okay, so we have some stuff in here. What else can we do, or what else do I do normally? Well, one of the main things is I will rotate things or flip things or align them pretty often, right? So if we grab these, and when you see me dragging along here, it's usually just change selection modes. So if you see this flying around the direction, it's probably just because I'm picking UVs or edges or whatnot. So one of the things I'll do a lot is rotate, which is simply in, where are we? Modify, rotate, and I have that set to a hotkey as well. So sometimes you just want to rotate something quick. You can, of course, press E and do it that way, but I have it set in increments of 90 degrees, so it's really quick. And then I also have flip. So if you want to face something the other way, and these have options as well. So you could say which direction, because I might want to flip horizontal. I don't have a hotkey separate for both. It's usually, I'll pop into the menu and say, I want to do a lot of flipping for horizontal right now. And then you could say where it flips around. And then another one there is align. So this is one I'll use pretty often with the selection tools. So let's just grab this whole edge here by holding shift, double clicking, and we have that whole line. So we could either scale, and you notice I have this one here too. So I'm going to get rid of those. And what I'm going to do usually, if you have both, is I'll take this edge, because this edge is here too, right? It's the same edge. I'll convert it to UVs, and then I'll deselect the other ones. So I do that pretty often as well, selecting an edge or a bunch of faces, and then getting rid of the sides I don't want. So if you're doing a command and you realize, oh crap, I have all that stuff over there, just convert to UVs and then control deselect. So for aligning things, a lot of times I'll just use scale, right, to get it straight, but you have another option. It's the very first one. I have a hotkey for that too, but this is going to depend, right? So you're basically saying, do you want to align to a minimum value, a maximum value, or an average? And this is true for both vertical and horizontal. So this can come in handy. So maybe we'll say minimum U value, hit apply, and then see it brought it all the way to the bottom there, and it's using that bottom UV as kind of its guide point. So maybe we'll try minimum U, hit apply, and now it brought everything over to the left. And so this can be really handy. Here's the center, right? It's averaging it out. So if I want to align a bunch of things so they're straight, I'll do this, and then I'll just reuse that hotkey over and over. Again, scaling can work too, but usually, see, it's just bringing me into the center, unless you want to change your pivot point by holding D, right? Like a lot of times I'll do D and then V. So change pivot point as well as snap to verts, and then you could use scale like that too. So there's another way to do that, but it is something that I do pretty often. Okay, so we saw cut, which we do often, right? Where I select these, press my hotkey, or shift right click, cut, or go into the menu, whatever works for you. That's one important thing, right? For manipulating your UVs. But what if we want to put things back together? And that's where sew comes in handy. And so you'll see, haha, sorry, another edge light up whenever you're highlighting a shared edge. So these UVs over here, they share that edge. So it's telling me that if I run the sew command, it's going to combine those together. So I'll go modify, or cut and sew, apologies, hit sew, and boom, they're together. That's really awesome, and we're going to use that a lot. There's also interactive tools for these if you'd rather do it in real time under the tools menu. So for instance, cut. That's pretty cool, right? I'll show you it one more time. We'll zoom in and we'll do it vertical. So you can just cut like that. And then there's the opposite, of course. So, and you just click and drag. And it's a little more fun like that, to be honest, but I don't use it that often because my needs are just having it instant usually. The other option is, and you'll see me do this all the time, right? So let me move these UVs a little further. There's one called cut and sew, or sorry, move and sew. And so this will bring your shells together and then sew them, right? And so one way to see this, let's see here, move and sew. You can find it here and see how it moved the entire island there. So I find that really handy all the time when I'm manipulating the UVs. So shift right click and up is that one. So I'll just do that a lot. Okay, let's see. Next, I want to talk about, let's see here real quick. I want to talk about the snapping tools in general. I mentioned that when I'm scaling stuff, sometimes I will hold V to snap to verts and stuff. So that's just good to know in general, is that if you're trying to move things around, holding V by default should snap to other verts, right? And it's going to go to where the center of your gizmo is there. X is going to do to the grid. Let's see how it's stuck to the grid there. And then J normally is what I use as well for percents. And so I don't know what it's set at right now. I believe you could change it in your actual options. Where are we at? There's a place to change. Let's see if I can find it real quick. Ah, here we are. So the reason I didn't notice it right away is that when you press J, you could see it actually turn on. So it's the step snap. So you could change the angle, and I believe you could change this for the move as well. Here we go. So it's moving 1 every time with J held down. So you could set that if you want to move a certain amount. I don't use J as often as the other snaps, but I wanted to share it because it still does come up. But the situations I'll use this stuff the most in, for example, would be like pressing D and V and then dragging this to a UV, letting go, then holding V and just snapping to other verts, right? Stuff like that comes in handy really often, or holding X and then snapping, to a grid line or intersection. So that stuff is great. Let's see here now. Okay, so some other tools to be aware of is one that I will do pretty much constantly is I will do my planar, right? So if I just grab this and then pretend, okay, I did my planar mapping, that looks weird, but then I'll immediately just unfold, just to the left twice. And it's here, there's an unfold brush. And we'll look at optimize in a second. But that's pretty much the main thing. I'm trying to see where it's normally located. I'm so used to my right click. That might actually just be it in the unfold. Boop. Modify. Unfold. Here it is all the way at the bottom. So I'll do that. And this is going to give you like your nicer looking unwrap. It's going to better represent what you have in there. And so most of the time, to be honest, when I'm unwrapping stuff, it goes really quick because I'll just set my, what's it called? The seams, cut them up, and then I'll select the shell, and then I'll just immediately go unfold. And then I'll grab another one, same thing, unfold. And now we have all those laid out. And you could see in the checker how much distortion it is. You could toggle that up here with this button. So that's really nice. And there's some options there. If you hover over it, it tells you what it does. So like right click is like multicolor mode, but you might have to toggle this right here too. This will show, as a heads up, this will show whatever texture you have applied to that model, whatever material, it'll show up here and here. And then of course you could disable seeing that. So we have those unfolded. And now, okay, what kind of edits we want to do after that? Well, there's a couple useful ones that I'll use, such as grab sometimes, which is cool. This is like you just, whatever's under your brush here, you can kind of smudge around. There is smudge too, but I kind of like grab a little better. And to change the brush size, just hold B, click left mouse and drag. And so this is nice. If you just want to finesse things a little, maybe get a little more UV space in the corner, right? Just like, all right, I'll just push these over, change the brush size, move them over a little more. There is a smear, which is similar. It has the brush and everything. They're kind of similar. At least I don't notice much of a difference. And then to get back to normal, we also have the unfold and optimize brushes. So if I'll click optimize here, it's going to make those UVs a little nicer and kind of conform them closer to their 3D counterpart, so you get less distortion. So I usually don't have to do that too often unless I am manually moving the UVs a lot and want to kind of nudge them back into place, right? That doesn't happen super often for me, but if you see me doing it, that's probably why. But otherwise, I will just, for instance, select all these and then just unfold. And then it makes it nice and pretty. And the algorithm works really well these days. So I'll just do that. Let's say we want to now merge these back together. Boom. And then I'll grab this and I'll unfold it. So it's super quick. Okay. In addition, there's some other things, right? So let's see. What do we got? Soft selection in general. Not too different from grab, I feel like, but this is available both in 3D view and here is just by pressing B. B will toggle it on and off, and then you can see your fall off. And if you hold B and drag, just like changing the other brush sizes, you'll have your soft selection. Difference here is you'll have to select something first before moving it. So if you don't want to move everything like grab, this will let you just move certain verts, right? It's not affecting anything outside of it. Okay. Let's go over pinning. Pinning is something that I'll use a lot to keep things in place. So for instance, let's say I have these UVs all over here, right? Maybe not the best, but I want them there, right? So I can go ahead now, select my edges. Let me turn off soft select, double click, and I'm going to get the outside ring. I only want this one, so I'm going to, again, convert to UVs. deselect these, and then up here, where we got edit pin selection. So I have it set to P right now, but if you press pin selection, whatever you do to those UVs, it's going to be ignored. They're going to stay where they are until you unpin them. So this is nice if you like the boundaries of your UV shell, or you want to put them in a specific place, like say you want to make it a rectangular, but you still want to smooth out the rest of it. You can go ahead and pin them. Now if I select it all, unfold, it's only doing the inside stuff, right? So it's like that. It kept the rest of them in place. And then when you're ready, you could go and unpin all. You could also unpin selection if you want to do a little at a time, but I usually just exclusively use those two. And then of course, get this right back. Let's see. A couple other things. Let's hide this sphere for now. So I'll get out of the view here. I'm gonna hide these. I'll delete that. Well, actually, I don't have to delete. I have it on a layer. So I'm gonna hide that layer, open another one, get rid of my history real quick. And I have this cube. So I want to show you a tool called Match UVs. This I find really useful. Say you have a bunch of things. Say you like made a bunch of 3D coins and they're all similar, but they were different ones, and you want to make sure that all the UVs are in the exact same spot, so you only have to texture it once, really, or that they're using the same texture image. And you forgot to unwrap them before you duplicated it everywhere, anything like that. So for instance, I got these two, I guess they kind of look like windows here, but these two groups of polygons. Now you have a couple options, and one thing I used to do is grab them and then one at a time hold V and then drag them and then do this to each of them. Kind of tedious. And then I went from there, and instead I would select them and then scale to each side. And this all works, and depending on the complexity, I might use these techniques. But if it's like a whole thing or something way more complex, what I do now is I'll select all of them, and then you have a tool that will match them together. So let's see if I remember where it is. Under Modify, Match UVs. And it's in the exact same spot. Now you have to be careful with this though, because sometimes, make sure you look in the options box, the tolerance, depending on the scale of your thing, might not be set right. So if we do 0.01, it does nothing. And then if we try 1, it's going to the extreme. So you have to find that sweet spot. So if it's not working right away, try to mess with the tolerance. Right here, I just did 0.1 and it worked out. So that's really useful. I use Match UVs a lot. Another one is Straighten Shell, I believe it was. Straighten UVs. So you see what happened there. If I make it a little more obvious, they're kind of skewed. I'll select them, shift right click, straighten UVs, and it kind of squared them off for me, which is really nice. I'm sure they're in here too. There's so many. Here it is towards the bottom. So I even have a hotkey for that. There's so many tools that will get you where you need to go really quickly. And so I think it's important to point those out because they're not always obvious, and they're things I use pretty often when I work, and I don't even really think about it as much anymore. So I want to highlight them here. A couple other things we'll look at is you got these buttons up here. This one will do a shaded view. So you can see, it's a little easier to see how much space things take up within your UV space. And if I flip it, it's red. That just means it's kind of flipped from the orientation in the 3D world. Usually it doesn't cause too many problems these days. It can if you're baking to a normal map. And I'll usually have them the right side or remove if there's duplicates outside of the 0 to 1 space. I wouldn't worry about that right now, but just know that if it is red, it usually means that it's flipped. In addition to that, we can toggle that between wireframe and that. And then you also have distortion view. And there's some options there too. But if you click that, it's going to show you, based on color, how distorted something is. And so usually it means like If it's red, it's getting less than ideal pixel density, and if it's blue, it has a little more compared to the rest. So I just try to get things as close to white as possible and try to avoid red. Blue I don't mind as much, but essentially when you're unwrapping things, it's a good idea to check that on just to make sure that nothing is like, because you might be missing a polygon and it's like all the way over there and you didn't notice at first. And you know, when you texture, you're seeing these streaks everywhere and you're like, ah, crap, what went wrong? This would be something to search for. And then of course you could always go in and then unfold it. Of course I had 2 on them now, so we could always get back on and match them up again or whatever. And you see it in through 3D view as well. Another button is the one right next to it, which will show and hide the borders. So your seams, your texture seams in the seams in the 3D view. Again, as I talked about these two, this will show and hide the checkers. This will show it in your 0 to 1 space or whatever texture is currently applied there. And then you could switch with this kind of drop down if you need. As I mentioned earlier, control right click will let you switch between different selection modes, right? So if you have a vert selected and you want to go to edges, you go to edges, and they go back and forth, which is really nice. I think there was 1 or 2 more things. Okay, let's say you're using a wide texture. Let me turn those off. So you're using, for instance, a 256 by 512. So it's non-standard, it's non-square. And you apply it and you press this button to look at it. It'll look squished. It'll try its best to fit within, or it will fit within the 1-to-1 space. So it's going to turn it into like a 256 by 256, for instance. But there's this button over here that if you click it, it will use the same ratio as the image. So if it's tall or wide, it's going to represent that properly. So it might be a lot easier to UV map for instance, if you have your texture first and you're unwrapping to the texture, it's really handy to be able to just see it right. Or if you're just unwrapping wide, in general, it helps to toggle that. So be aware of that. And okay, so let's say we're finishing up, right? We did all we needed to do. I'll grab this one, and then I guess let's just turn on the spheres for fun too. So what will happen, we'll get rid of this one. You select them both. Another tool I will use, I'm going to shrink these down a little, is the UV layout tool. And this I won't always use, but if I don't want to pack, or I want a head start on packing everything in to the 0 to 1 space here, right? So we could make a texture for it. We want to use as much of the space as possible, right? And so sometimes you have a lot of pieces and it could take a while. So I'll use a tool called Layout UVs, which is right here. And there's options for that one too, a lot of options. And I'm not going to go into all these options right now. I definitely, if you're not getting results you like, it's worth tweaking. Stuff like the resolution, the rotation, how many degrees things rotate, as well as the padding. Go into that, find some stuff online, read into it, and just experiment. You get some better results. But even if I just hit layout right now, it'll do its thing. There it is. So not the best. It tried, right? With some shapes and some things, it'll wind up better. It took about roughly a minute. I paused real quick. That way you guys didn't have to wait with me. So I think the reason it took so long was due to some of the settings I had. So I hadn't used it super recently in this case. But it can help, especially if you have a lot of square shapes and if you turn rotation on, which I had it off. So a lot of these things are still, they could have been optimized if they rotated a certain way, and maybe it would have filled up the space more. But I do encourage you to experiment with that, especially if you have a 3D object or multiple objects that are going on one texture sheet and you want to fit them within that space and kind of have a quick way of doing it. Now, okay, and the last thing, you probably know this one already, but I'm going to throw it in for good measure. You're done and you want to paint on these textures or just have the UV map for reference in Photoshop. You got this button right here, the UV Snapshot tool. You click that and then you say where you want it to go, and it'll save out in whatever kind of image format you want. And voila, you have your texture or your UV is all ready to paint on. So there was a handful of tools. There's definitely a lot more, but these are the ones you'll see me using most often, and I'll usually go back and forth between them pretty quickly. And honestly, I probably only use, out of all of those, a quarter of them. Really, it's just putting down where the seams are, selecting the shell, hitting unwrap, and then, you know, some sewing and moving verts around here and there. Nothing too crazy, but now you know the suite of tools that I use, and hopefully you learned something.